But today I'm going to talk about some of our experiences in North Dakota related to livestock water quality, some programming we've done there on the extension side, and how does that relate to situations and scenarios throughout the Great Plains. So water just is critical for livestock, just like humans. Just a 10% loss in body water for most domestic livestock will result in death. So it's very important. It's also critical for a lot of their bodily regulating body temperature, reproduction, lactation. So a lot of those critical functions of their body. When we look at livestock, their water requirements vary highly between different types of livestock, the class or the level of production those animals are in, and then also for temperature. So this is just a table that shows requirements for beef cattle, and you see that a lactating cow is nearly double the requirements of a dry cow. So lactating cow that has a calf and is milk and producing milk for that calf. And then when we look at temperatures, we have 60 degrees and 90 degrees here. When we increase from that 60 to 90 degrees, for most of our classes of beef cattle, our water requirements double with that as well. And so it's really important within any type of grazing system, especially, but any type of livestock production system, that we have adequate quantities of water for them available. However, in our grazing systems especially, water is one of our most limiting factors. Across the Great Plains, many of our livestock producers still depend on surface water sources for their livestock. This is a series of photos from a multi-generational ranch in western North Dakota. From 2020 through 2022, we experienced a statewide drought in 21. That was one of our most severe droughts on record. So it was up there with the drought of the 80s and the 30s in terms of kind of reference of how bad it was for our producers that year. And this is the first time these producers had ever experienced that water location or that dugout, that dam going dry or to this level. And this is something we heard from producers and are hearing from producers throughout the Great Plains, is that with the droughts that they're having, is that we're running into more water quantity issues. And that can be due to a series of several different factors. So are droughts more severe? In this case, this was one of our most severe droughts. But also these water bodies, especially when you think of stock dams and dugouts, they were put in place a long time ago. They're coming to their end of their life. So they're filling with silt and filling, and we don't have a lot of federal programs that are available to establish dugouts anymore, or refresh those dugouts is what our producers call that. So digging them back out and making them available. They'd rather invest in new water developments that are more reliable. So some of the solutions, when we think about short-term solutions for addressing these problems, the immediate one is hauling water, which is very time-consuming, can be very expensive. Other things that can be put in place are temporary pipelines, and then ultimately is moving livestock if you can't do either of these other options. And when we're in a drought, forage is really important, obviously. You guys know that. We just went through a drought. You guys just went through a drought last year here. And we don't want to give up using a forage source because there's not water. So long-term solutions is putting in some type of more reliable water source, wells, rural water taps, pipelines. There's also challenges with these things. So wells can take a long time to get a well put in place. The waiting lists with the number of well drillers available is really long in a lot of places, especially when you're competing with industries. Rural water, some of our rural water systems are at capacity and they can't add additional sources or people on that. And so there are some barriers. And then in certain places we have groundwater quality issues such as Nebraska. And so that's another consideration. Just because you put a well doesn't mean you're going to have better quality water, which we're going to talk about next. So some of the water quality challenges that we see that impact livestock specifically are going to be those salts and minerals in that water, so total dissolved solids. When we talk about the salts, sulfates is a huge problem, especially in the northern portion of the Great Plains. As we move south here, nitrates becomes an issue. That's not something I've encountered much in North Dakota or in South Dakota, I know either. And then cyanobacteria blooms is another challenge that we see. And so when we talk about those salts specifically, these are a series of photos from the same dugout in western North Dakota. And what happens is, as we go through a growing season or we're in a drought, water evaporates and those salts become more concentrated because we still have the same levels of salts, they're not going away. And so they reach a threshold where they can become potentially toxic to livestock. This is data from a 4-year project that extension agents across the state of North Dakota worked with livestock producers and screened water sources from them. The red lines are groundwater sources, blue lines are surface water sources, and we have from 2020 all the way through 23. And really I want to depict this from here. What you should take away is water quality is highly variable. It varies, especially surface water quality, because of those environmental factors that influence it. So we see variation across years, and we see variation within years. And so when we look at this figure specifically, we look at 21, we see a rise because we had a drought, a statewide drought in 21. And then as we proceeded through 21, we actually, those in surface water, we've seen our total dissolved solids increase. And that actually continued until we got to April of 2022, where we had a major blizzard in April. Really bad timing, but it was really a blessing because it provided critical water and actually put an end to our drought. And then as we go through our continuing years, we see that throughout the growing season, as we get to those drier periods in July, August, that we see that rise in total dissolved solids within our surface waters. We see some fluctuation in our groundwater, but not as much. And honestly here, I think when we're seeing, especially in 23, the noise is that there was less samples collected. Producers call our extension agents and want them to come out when there's a problem or when they think something's wrong. And so we had some extreme cases there, and that kind of skewed our data a little bit. In 21, we actually started monitoring sulfate levels as well, or screening for them. And you see that similar trend where our groundwater levels stay pretty steady, but we see fluctuation within our surface water levels, and really high ones in 21 until we got to that April storm, and it dropped our sulfate levels across the state. One of the misconceptions I hear when I'm talking to people is that water quality is a western part of North Dakota problem, or it's somehow geographically influenced, which in some places it is. With our geology in North Dakota, we have a lot of high salts naturally in our formations, and it is a statewide challenge. And those salts tend to be sulfate-based. And so you see water quality issues. This is just a sulfate map, but we see it across the state. Some of these are groundwater. The one in Grand Forks County, so eastern side of the state, right there, that was a well, and it was really poor quality well. And so we like to make generalizations, but I always tell producers, let's screen, know what you have out there, because things fluctuate. There is no hard and fast rule of thumb. Within the same pasture, we have sites that have poor water quality next to a site or a dugout well that's perfectly acceptable. So there's a lot of variability depending where in that landscape that well dugout is located as well. Now, focusing in on Nebraska, there are certain areas of Nebraska that are more prone to high salts, TDS and sulfates, and those are the formations here in the southeast and then a little bit up here in the northwest. And so those formations are from the Cenozoic, or the Cretaceous and the Paleozoic time. So the Niobrara, the Dakota sandstone formations are two of them that have higher sulfates, higher TDS. And I was confirmed today out with one of your beef extension specialists, and she said, yep, most of the calls I get regarding sulfates are from the southeast part of the state. Unlike us in North Dakota, you guys also have some challenges with nitrates. And so I think when you're thinking about your water sources, whether it's groundwater, surface water, being aware of what aquifer you're accessing, what is the quality of that, because putting a well in might not be the solution. And we want to know what we're dealing with before we get to that point. I've had calls from ranchers in North Dakota that put in a well and they got cost share on it, fantastic, really bad water quality to the point where, and we'll talk about this later of why this happens, but that it wasn't safe for all their animals. Some of their animals could drink from it, but not all their animals could drink from that. And so it's really important to do that research ahead of time and make sure you know what you're accessing and that it is safe for your animals instead of investing that money into a water development. Looking at surface water, some of the challenges, probably no surprise here, especially we look at lakes in the impairments. Two of the major impairments, we have total nitrogen levels and total phosphorus levels. And coming from things like agricultural runoff is a primary source for those type of contaminants within our lakes and rivers and surface waters. And what does that lead to? It leads to things like cyanobacteria or harmful algal blooms, and these are caused by high levels of phosphorus, in particular within a water source. That phosphorus is bound to those sediments, and so once it's there, it's really difficult to get rid of it. So having measures in place to help protect that water and prevent those nutrients from getting in the water is really important. One thing we're seeing and I'm hearing is we used to see these in July and August primarily. And outside of that window where we had those hot, dry conditions that facilitated the growth of this bacteria, we didn't hear a lot about it. The past few years, our first blooms have been in late May. And last year we had blooms occurring in October. And this isn't just a livestock issue. It impacts all living creatures. So it can be toxic to humans. Usually that's in the form of respiratory conditions or rashes if we're coming in contact with it. Every year, especially in fall, we hear about pets, especially dogs that are used for hunting, that are drinking from a water source that end up dying because they have drank from a water that has a cyanobacteria bloom. So this isn't just a livestock agricultural issue. This is a really big issue, especially when we think about recreation and some of our public water sources as well. So now, how does this all impact livestock? Why do we care on the livestock side? Clean water, just like for us, is really important to animal performance. Really because when we have those high salts and those other things in our water, it reduces their feed intake, which then reduces our average daily gains. There's a lot of research that's been conducted out there that supports that. And so when we look at calves alone, it's almost a third a pound a day difference when we have clean water versus a poorer water quality source. And so that across a herd is a really big economic impact to those producers if they have a good water quality source versus something that has poor water quality. What does that mean? What is the thresholds? What does it look like? What are we looking for? So when we look at total dissolved solids, really when we start seeing some performance differences when we get above 3,000 parts per million. We start seeing health impacts above 5,000 parts per million. So things like loose stool, poor performance, and really want to be cautious with those animals that are either lactating or pregnant. We get above 7,000, we don't want those animals that are lactating, pregnant, consuming from that water source. And above 10,000, it can cause brain damage, or some central nervous system disorders, and ultimately death. Sulfates is really one of our most common issues in the northern part of the Great Plains. When we look at the NRC recommendations, they're less than 500 parts per million for calves, 1,000 for mature cattle. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, depending on the diet of those animals. So when we look at a forage-based diet, so an animal that's on pasture or is getting fed mostly hay and not something like corn or grain in their diet, then we have a higher threshold. It's about 2,500 parts per million. But if they have a high concentrate diet, there's also sulfur and sulfates in that diet that are going to influence the level they're intaking, and so that threshold is going to be lower. Also, the rumen pH changes, and that impacts how they can what's going on in their rumen or in their gut, and so that impacts their ability to have higher sulfates levels in their diet. And Mary Dronowski here has done some really interesting work on that, so she's definitely the person to talk to. Now, what does that look like? What should we look for symptoms? So one of the things sulfates do is it can cause a copper deficiency in that animal. Some of the first signs we see that there is an issue with sulfates is loose stool in those animals, and then we start seeing some central nervous system symptoms. And some things that we've seen during drought is we see staggering, cows that are down. Also, we've seen animals that go blind. And then in extreme cases, there's a disease called polioencephalomalacia, or PEM. Dr. Charlie can correct me if I said that wrong. And that's a brain disorder in cattle. And so this is really one of the most serious things we see. We do get quite a few during drought, especially reports of animals that die due to high levels of sulfates in surface waters. Nitrate toxicity is really challenging, especially in drought, because it's in our forages, it accumulates in our drought stress forages, and it also can be in our water sources. And so what nitrates do within an animal's body is they're going to convert that to nitrite. And when we have an excessive amount of that in the rumen, is that it is going to get converted to methemoglobin in the blood. And that inhibits the ability for it to oxygen uptake. And so basically the animal dies due to lack of oxygen. So this is the same thing as blue baby syndrome, but we're more susceptible to this as a ruminant because of what the activity that's going on in the rumen. And it's really hard because we have it in both our feed and our water. So we need to make sure that we're testing both sources and that animal, and we're not exceeding those thresholds with that cumulative impact there. So what are some of the signs? So first, if we have chronic toxicity, so small amounts over a long period of time, it's going to be things like watery eyes, reduced appetite, weight loss, some night blindness, possibly abortions. I know in North Dakota, after 21, we've seen a lot of, in 22, that spring, we heard lots of, cows either that were open that fall or the following spring, there was a lot of abortions. And in many cases, that could be traced back to nitrates in the feeds that were being fed due to nitrate toxicity of forages that were harvested during the drought. Acute toxicity is going to be accelerated pulse, labored breathing, muscle tremors, staggering. We're going to have that blue-brown membranes, and then death. And so if it's acute, we need to call our veterinarian immediately. On the chronic, we can dilute our feeds and mix feeds. And so just because our feed has nitrate, our water has nitrate, doesn't mean that can't be used. We just have to make sure that we're not exceeding those thresholds for those animals. And what are those? So there's different tests for different forms of nitrate or nitrogen. And so this chart shows those. I'm just going to focus on the nitrates in parts per million. And so if we look at that here, we want to start using caution when we get above 440 parts per million. And then if it's above 1,329, it can be toxic, and we don't want to feed, it could cause nitrate poisoning. So depending where we are, we can mix those feeds, we can, there's animals that have low levels of nitrate in their water, and so Mary and I were talking about this today, because out of Interact, they have the nitrates in the water. Not safe necessarily for humans, but for livestock, it's okay because it's within that acceptable range. And actually having some of nitrates influences what's going on in their rumen, and those animals can have some rumen biota that are actually helping them adjust to that nitrate level. So cyanobacteria, not all cyanobacteria is toxic. We're going to make that assumption when we're talking to people in terms of landowners, producers using that water source. But only certain species produce toxins. They produce either a neurotoxin or a hepatotoxin. And that what we can do is we do visual assessments. They can be, you can test for certain species, but without sending a test in or to see if the species that produce those toxins are present. But it can be really expensive if we're trying to narrow it down to look for and test for specific toxins. But with cyanobacteria, typically we actually will discover a dead animal before we're going to discover what the cause was. It happens very fast, 5 to 20 minutes a lot of the time within the time they consume that water. There isn't any research on how much do we consume. So I get that question all the time. Well, how much can they consume? I don't know. There's not research on that. And how do you know how much what their intake was anyways? It would be really difficult to figure that out. So what are the symptoms of cyanobacteria poisoning? We're going to see those weakness, muscle tremors, staggering, so a lot of those central nervous system type symptoms, difficulty breathing, convulsions, bloody diarrhea, and a lot of time, like I said, you're going to see a dead animal before you actually can figure out what's going on. And also the other tricky part about diagnosing or knowing this is the source is these algae blooms move across the water. So we have wind is going to get pushed across, and that might not be where that animal is. So walking around that water and seeing if there's other dead wildlife around there is another good way to narrow it down. But ultimately, then also calling your veterinarian, getting them involved to diagnose, do a necropsy to see what was the cause of death. So some things that we've been doing in North Dakota in terms of screening water quality at the farm or ranch level is our extension agents all have handled TDS or EC meters, and we have them submit a sample or recommend somebody submitting a sample to a laboratory for further analysis if we have a threshold above 4,500 parts per million. Because remember, 5,000 parts per million is when we start seeing those potential health impacts. The other reason that we pick this threshold, it's a little under that, is because calibration errors, and since these estimate TDS levels off of electrical conductivity is going to level off with the readings as they get higher, and so it's not 100% accurate, but it does give us it's a good screening tool to say, okay, this might be an issue. Further testing should be conducted to see where we're at. For us, the sulfate test strips have been a fantastic tool because that is the bigger challenge. We see more waters with sulfate issues than TDS issues. And so these are the test strips in the bottom corner of the slide there. And you dip them in the water, hold them in the water for a little bit, and then you're going to match them up to the side of that container. And it gives you a range. If it's less than 200 parts per million, greater than 400, greater than 800, greater than 1,200, and greater than 1,600. So we recommend submitting a sample to the lab for analysis if it's greater than 800 parts per million in a grazing system, because that 1,000 parts per million is that threshold where we start to see that toxicity take place in our mature animals. There's also a similar tool for nitrates. There's nitrate test strips. We don't use them, but they're similar, they're very affordable. Same concept as sulfate test strips. And based off the reading I've done, I would say submitting a sample if you're at around 500 parts per million for further analysis to see where you're at. And all of these, like I said, very affordable. The EC meters that we use are about $88, $100. Sulfate test strips, it's around $50 for a container of 100 of them. So very affordable tool for a rancher to have in their vehicle, go test that water before they're moving animals to the next pasture, to know if there's a risk and if they should maybe be considering a different alternative. And we've had several ranchers that have started doing that with the programming that we've done. Cyanobacteria, a little trickier, so we just do a visual screening initially, and then we can test that water, help collect a sample, test that water for, send it to the lab, test it for the presence of the algae species that produce the toxins. I do know there are labs that will test for specific toxins, but those, you have multiple tests for different toxins and they add up very quickly and are very expensive, and there's not very many labs that do that. And if we're working with a farmer rancher, it's not worth that expense to them. And it can lead down a really big rabbit hole. And with how fast these act, let's get the animals out of there, let's watch that source and make sure that they're safe. So example of how this has worked for us in North Dakota and the success of these programs. In 2021 alone, our extension agents across the state screened over 1,500 samples. 151 of those had elevated levels of total dissolved solids, which I'm characterizing as greater than 5,000 parts per million. And 329 had elevated levels of sulfates characterized as greater than 1,200 parts per million. Of those samples that we screened, 138 were sent to lab for additional testing, and of those producers that we interacted with, 214 made some type of management change on their operation, whether it was moving animals, continuing to monitor, installing an alternative water system. And communicating the results of these screenings with our state and federal partners resulted in over $7 million being brought into the state to help with livestock water quality assistance, whether that was paying for, so the FSA adjusted their ELAP program, which is Emergency Livestock and Assistance Program. Thank you. It's too many acronyms to remember. And so they adjusted that to allow for water hauling based off of the information that we had shared with them. At the state level, our state Department of Water Resources activated a program that aided with or provided cost share assistance for installing some type of water development. And there was lots of different options that qualified under that. To date, so since we've started this program, there's been management changes at 312 locations. Of those locations, 76% of them was a location with potentially toxic water. And so really impactful in terms of how many of those producers actually made a decision to make a change. 36, and I know more, but this is from our survey respondents, and nobody likes to complete a survey. So 36 participants installed some type of water development. And based off of the data we collected, that resulted in over 64,000 head of livestock being saved from these screenings, potentially. And then that's not counting performance benefits to those animals from having a better quality water. Other things that we've developed in tools to help, we have sampling kits to help collect those water sources, whether that's giving those to somebody for collecting the water sources, so sampling containers, and then these livestock water testing guidelines that are step-by-step. How do we safely collect an accurate sample of where those animals are drinking from, and safely do that in the cases of cyanobacteria. And so either the producer will do this themselves, or our extension agents will go out and assist with this, our soil conservation districts as well. And then depending on what their concerns are. We recommend an analysis for livestock, which includes our veterinary diagnostic lab has a livestock water quality panel, which includes TDS, sulfates, nitrates, and pH. And then there's also a cyanobacteria panel to see if those species are present that produce the toxins. And so steps on how to do that, and then we also have a list of different testing labs and the cost for shipping to those labs. Now, when we talk about managing water quality, our options are a little different, right? So our first immediate option is we want to restrict or eliminate access to that water source if it's potentially toxic or is toxic. That can be fencing it out. I think this might be a great opportunity for virtual fence in the future, but that's my bias. And especially when we think of larger water bodies. And in some cases, we have to move animals from a pasture, unfortunately. Providing or using an alternative water source, and sometimes we have another one in the pasture. So we just have to fence this one out, make sure they're not going to that, and we're using this other one. But also then that might include developing a different water source, whether that's a well, maybe it's refreshing a dugout that's existing, which I know we have had several people do successfully in the last couple of years. And then also just being aware of those assistance programs, because it's expensive, and there's a lot of assistance programs out there between state, federal, as well as some of our NGOs have some really good programs available too. That's going to obviously vary from state to state, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details there. But reaching out to those people at the local level is really important to connect with those potential resources. One thing that keeping in mind with all of this, especially when we're in a drought situation, is that it's just easy, just haul water. Well, it's not that easy depending on how many animals you have and how many pastures you have, and it's a lot of water, and maybe you're doing this daily. So that increased labor, and farmers and ranchers that already are maxed out for labor anyways, and so that's not always an easy solution. And then I think we always often overlook that increased stress on those farm families and communities. During 21, there was a story from one of our county agents went out screening to water, off the chart sulfates. I don't know how he only had one dead animal. It was the first time that they'd ever rented a pasture, only water source in the pasture, and they had to move all those animals. They couldn't utilize that pasture safely. And so that's really emotional too, to have to give up using that forage because there's poor water quality. And I think also thinking forward, how do we, as we're making land agreements or we're renting, be screening water quality is something we need to think about and incorporating into that process so that we know ahead of time what is that quality of that water, and are those animals safe, and are they going to have access to enough good quality water. Honestly, that's all I have today. So I'm happy to answer any questions on our program in North Dakota, water quality in general, grazing systems, anything.
Thanks. How important is, or how big of a factor is drought in all the different times where you found water quality issues?
It is a huge factor, but there are just some sources that would have water quality issue regardless, especially when with some of our geology, we have outcroppings of geologic formations that have really high sulfates. One of the most common challenge we have on agricultural lands in North Dakota is the salts. And so it's definitely something that's present in in a lot of areas across the state. But then as we go through a drought and those salts or sulfates become more concentrated, it becomes a bigger challenge and issue.
Thanks.
So you talked a lot about water quality management for the livestock per se, but what about ranchers managing their livestock to not degrade water quality? And are there also any discussions about how long is it sustainable to have large amounts of livestock? Because drought is probably going to get worse. The more kind of intensely you utilize your environment, the the more the water is going to become degraded. Is there a kind of a critical threshold at which, or after which it is no longer possible to even sustain large livestock herds? And are people even thinking about that?
I think it depends. What are your water quality issues and challenges? So are the ones that I talked about, livestock aren't probably contributing to those. There are definitely issues that they are contributing to. And actually, so one of our side goals of this project and this program when we started this monitoring program is how do we communicate with those farmers and ranchers and make them, help influence them to make a management change that can have a broader impact on water quality in our landscape. And there is a lot of research that's been done within grazing systems looking at if we have an off-site, or off-stream water source, off-wetland water source that's of a high, or it's a good quality, that without fencing out that other water source, those animals are drawn and prefer that water quality, or that higher quality water. And so that is kind of one of our sub-goals. I'm hoping to connect with our DEQ now when they do their next assessment and look ahead. Since we've had so many ranchers that have made changes, are we seeing an impact on some of our surface water quality? And so there is definitely that public value that comes with that. I think also we need to be aware of some of the negatives of removing livestock from these landscapes. And especially when we think about land conversion and the suitability of these lands to be converted. So what would happen to some of these lands if we don't have livestock out there grazing? Conversion for other sources of food production. In the northern part of the Great Plains, we have huge issues with invasive perennial grasses that alter the nutrients cycling within that landscape. And so there's lots of research that shows those grasses actually produce more increased nitrogen within that system. And so when we remove livestock that are helping manage that, what happens within that landscape and with that water quality? And also, if we have more biomass that's breaking down and releasing phosphorus into that surface water too. So I think if we have good management within these systems, we can maintain things. And I think livestock are a critical part of that piece of that management, but they also need to be managed.
Miranda, I really appreciate this talk. I learned something, and I think of myself as a cattle producer, so this is all good. I have a question, and I hope my intelligence is correct here. You've had a large increase in fracking, hydraulic fracking in North Dakota. Are you seeing any impacts on your livestock from that industry and water quality, or is it too early to tell?
So the problem with knowing that, and I wouldn't say it's from fracking because of where the geologic formations that we're fracking are located. I would say there's side effects in terms of produced water spills that would be my largest concern. And actually do some research in this area, but the problem is that we need baseline information. What was the water quality before this happened? Because if we don't have that data, I can't say that that's what caused it. And so that's one thing we encourage ranchers that we work with in Western North Dakota to have that. And it can't be just a screening that you do yourself. It has to be a laboratory analysis that shows that this water source had this water quality, this event took place, and now this is where we're at. And so that's one of the challenges we have, but definitely if we have produced water come in, that's gonna influence things. The other thing is what's the constituents in that water, and so when we have produced water, it's gonna be mostly sodium chloride based. And so it definitely is still toxic, but it's gonna be a different type of salt. It's like it's miles.
And the water doesn't come back up?
So they bring the water back up, but it's captured on pad. And so really the biggest challenge is those pipelines that are transporting our produced water that have that potential for leaks and breaks. And especially gathering lines are a little more difficult. So there's lines that are for transport, that would be from between facilities. Gathering lines go from between individual pads to a facility. And so within a gathering line, there's a lot of fluctuation because it's not constant flow. And so it's much more difficult to monitor changes in those lines and detect leaks. Technology's gotten a lot better, and so hopefully that reduces the risk. I know the industry people we work with, they don't want these things to happen. Most of them are local now, and so they're tied to those communities. They don't want those things to happen. So they're trying to use the best technology out there. But that's one of the challenges, those gathering lines and detecting leaks and spills from those.
Any other questions? Okay, with that, then thank you, Miranda, for your presentation today, and thank you everyone for coming. I hope to see you again in a couple of weeks for our next seminar.